Well, good morning. It's good to see a full room here this morning. My name is Scott Morris. I'm a senior fellow here at the Center for Global Development. I'm also the director of the very newly rebranded U.S. Development Policy Initiative at CGD. It is my great pleasure to be able to introduce our esteemed speaker this morning. Gayle Smith has served as the 17th Administrator of USAID since December of 2015. Prior to that, she served as Special Assistant to President Obama and Senior Director for Development and Democracy at the NSC. As resumes go, that's already pretty impressive, so I'm not going to read the longer version. But it is, well, let me try to sum up this way. It's fair to say that for decades, Gayle Smith has been thinking about, writing about, advocating for, and ultimately setting policy on a wide range of issues that pertain to global development and to America's role in the world. Gayle is here today in her capacity as USAID Administrator, and we'll be hearing more about the good things happening at that agency shortly, including in the form of a very cool video. But I actually wanted to take a minute to highlight Gayle's early tenure in the Obama administration, and particularly her leadership on the foundational work that resulted in the Presidential Policy Directive on Global Development. Now, this is selfish on my part because it also happens to be the time in which I got to work with Gayle directly, but it is worth recalling for better reasons than that. One, consider the timing. The directive was issued in September 2010. Here in the United States, we were just beginning to see the signs that the economy was truly back from the abyss, and I would say thanks to really critical efforts that began in the Bush administration, continued in the Obama administration, and had the full support of the Congress. But in 2010, we still had unemployment that was hovering around 10%, and we were just seeing signs of monthly job growth after just a remarkable loss of 9 million jobs as a result of the Great Recession. So that's a pretty fragile time domestically for a president to be personally invested in a new blueprint for America's engagement in other countries. But I will say that this president recognized, as have presidents before him, that smart engagement abroad directly serves our interests at home. And from that standpoint, we should always be striving to improve our efforts when it comes to development policy, just as we do so with diplomacy and defense. Now, it's also clear to me in retrospect that this important work would not have happened without Gayle's leadership in the White House, driving an interagency process over the course of many weeks as only she could. And lest this all sound too high-minded, let me just acknowledge that for Washington insiders, mere mention of the word interagency typically elicits eye rolls or other kinds of reactions like that. And I will simply say, as a former congressional staffer participating in that process, that Gayle knew how to use the filibuster to good effect when she had to. In the end, I think the path set in the policy directive and the big ideas that it contained, things like elevating U.S. leadership in multilateral settings, investing in innovation, they deserve to endure beyond this administration. They certainly aren't partisan ideas, and it's my hope that the new administration will continue to set a course for our development policy that reflects the best of America's values and interests, and in a way that reflects the world as it is today. So with that, let me say a brief word on format. We are going to see a short video from USAID. We will hear remarks from Administrator Smith. She will then be joined on stage by our own esteemed founding president of the Center for Global Development, Nancy Birdsall. They will have a conversation with each other and then turn to you for some questions. So with that, let's go to the video.
Our most basic common link is that we all inhabit this small planet. We all cherish our children's futures, and we are all mortal.
Today, we seek to move beyond the accomplishments of the past, to establish the principle that all the people are entitled to a decent way of life.
Let us not forget that each child saved, each refugee housed, each disease prevented, each barrier to justice brought down, each sword turned into a plowshare, brings us closer to peace, closer to freedom, closer to dignity.
America is a nation with a mission. And that mission comes from our most basic beliefs. Our aim is a democratic peace. A peace founded upon the dignity and rights of every man and woman.
We also know that progress in the most impoverished parts of our world enriches us all. So the United States will join with our allies to eradicate such extreme poverty in the next 2 decades by connecting more people to the global economy, by empowering women, by giving our young and brightest minds new opportunities to serve, and helping communities to feed, empower, and educate themselves. By saving the world's children from preventable deaths. That's how we'll confront the challenges of our time. This is how we will seize the promise of this moment in history. Who are we to believe that today's challenges cannot be overcome? When we've seen what changes the human spirit can bring. That is why we look to the future not with fear, but with hope.
So please join me in welcoming Gayle Smith.
I would say of our comms team, the production values at USAID have gone up, so thank you for that. Hello, everybody. It's really nice to be here, and I want to thank CGD for putting a great event together, but I also want to thank a friend of mine, Nancy Birdsall, for your extraordinary leadership. I remember when there wasn't a CGD, and you have built this into an essential pillar for our community, bringing an enormous amount of evidence and experience to bear in tackling global challenges. And you may not know, but I think you've had an influence also on what we've done as an administration, because what CG's done is insisted on rigor in our collective work. You've shined a light on the discipline of development, and by doing so, you've made all of us better and our work smarter and more impactful. So we're going to start with giving a shout out and some applause to Nancy. I also sort of feel like we're the elders now, Nancy, so we got to... I have to say this is a little bit weird. It feels like I'm sharing the last chapter in a memoir I haven't written. That's a plug to CGD. I just said nice things about you. I may want to write a book sometime. But in seriousness, I wanted to be here today to tell a story, and it's a story many of you know the pieces of, but I wanted to pull together because I think there's an extraordinary story to be told. Scott talked about the beginning of it, and he, by the way, was an extraordinary partner in that process, and we're still seeing the dividends of that, so thank you for that. But I think it's an important time to tell a story. Now, I know all of you pay attention, but as much as I would like it to be, the case is that most people don't pay attention to the issues we work on, or the agency I have the honor of serving. And for those who are not paying attention, it would be easy to have some assumptions, in particular about USAID, that simply don't reflect the organization I know today. I served on President Obama's transition team in 2008, overseeing all of the foreign assistance agencies. And I'd worked at USAID before, so I knew a little bit of what to expect. And I wasn't surprised when we found an agency filled with talented, dedicated professionals. I doubt that's changed in the 55 years that AID's been around. But although the profile of development had been raised during the Bush administration, we also found an organization that had been weakened institutionally over time. Its policy and budget functions had been removed. Trust and expectations of performance were low across the board. Given all of this, it shouldn't come as a surprise that USAID at the time was not a terribly confident and upbeat institution. But under President Obama's leadership, we set out to change that. And 8 years later, I'm proud to report that the USAID of today is not your grandmother's development agency. In fact, USAID today is more capable and confident than ever before. Confident enough to learn and capable enough to improve. And that's positioned us to get big and bold things done. I was thinking about this a little bit last week. We had donuts in the office to celebrate my first year as administrator, and donuts, as you probably know, tend to make one feel reflective. And so I was there reflecting, and I thought, this time has gone really quickly. I mean, it's been 1 year already, and so did the 7 years before that. But we've got a lot to show for that time. And as much as some may hang on to an outdated image of a weakened USAID, crippled by bureaucratic obstacles and other challenges, or to question the overall effectiveness of development, the numbers don't lie. 4.6 million lives saved. These are children and babies who are growing up and getting a real chance in life, in no small part because the U.S. saw an opportunity and seized it. Because we saw kids dying of illnesses we could prevent and diseases we could treat and did something about it. Because we followed the evidence and made investments in proven interventions. 9 million. These are the small farmers and other producers who used new technologies and practices to improve their harvests just last year through Feed the Future. These are the kinds of improvements that have led to drops in poverty between 7 and 36% in the areas where Feed the Future works, and helped producers, many of them women, boost their incomes by a combined $800 million in 2015. 5,000 megawatts. In 3 years, Power Africa has already closed on enough transactions to generate that much electricity and is tracking towards much more. And that's because the U.S. chose to use the influence and expertise of our government to help connect people and communities to power for the first time. And in doing so, we're helping to steadily break down one of the biggest barriers to growth on the African continent. And while we're at it, here's another really good Power Africa number, 54 billion. That's how much we've mobilized in private and public commitments, starting with the U.S. commitment of 7 billion. So not only are we laying a foundation for transformative change, we're not even footing the bulk of the bill. 11.5 million. That's how many people are on life-saving treatment for HIV and AIDS through PEPFAR, up from 2.1 million when President Obama took office. And an AIDS-free generation is indeed within sight. That's in no small part because of the leadership of not one, but two presidents. 60. That's the average number of humanitarian crises USAID has responded to every year of this administration. 60. We've deployed 24 disaster assistance response teams, widely considered the best in the world. Actually, that's a fact. That's not just an opinion. Over the last 8 years to coordinate U.S. efforts on major crises. We helped defeat Ebola in West Africa, took on severe food shortages in Ethiopia, Nigeria, natural disasters in Nepal, Haiti, and the Philippines. And we continue to respond to crises fueled by conflicts in Syria, South Sudan, Yemen, and Iraq. In every case, saving lives and meeting urgent needs in the face of extraordinary obstacles. We can point to results like this across the board in unlocking opportunities for women and girls, in connecting communities to safe drinking water, in reinforcing the building blocks of democracy. Unfortunately, I can't take the credit. Technically, I could, because I'm the only one standing up here, but I won't actually do that. So many factors have driven this progress. Pause briefly for water. And so many people have contributed to it, including many of you in this room today. But I want to share what I think are the 5 drivers that have contributed most to our success, in part to explain how we did it, and in part because each of these, I think, will be essential to our success going forward. The first is presidential leadership. In Barack Obama, we have a leader who gets it. He understands development intimately. He's lived it. And what he has done is nothing short of extraordinary. I'm talking about major investments and global calls to action on food security, access to electricity in Africa, global health, innovation, and more. But even that, he sees a bigger picture. He saw the potential in a weakened USAID and called on his team to invest in it, strengthen it, elevate it, and then expect it to deliver and even to lead. And not surprisingly, I am proud to say that USAID's done both. The President understands that development is a key instrument of American power, so he elevated it to be on par with defense and diplomacy. He understands that the development perspective offers key insights to inform policy discussions, so he brought USAID to the policy table. And he called on all of us to step up our game, to invest in research and innovation, to follow where the evidence leads, and to reduce dependence over the long term. That's leadership, and it matters. And it doesn't only have to come from the White House. In fact, it shouldn't, and that isn't enough. The second major driver of progress has been bipartisan support in Congress. And I will just say, I look at people like Carol Peasley here, and whoever would have thought that development was going to be the space where we would register all this bipartisan cooperation? Wouldn't have thought that 15 years ago. That was back in the days when USAID was Washington's favorite political football. First emerging during the Bush administration around HIV, AIDS, and malaria, we now have a consensus on development that I would almost call nonpartisan. And look at how it's paid off. In a town that doesn't exactly have a reputation for political harmony, especially of late, we've gotten some big things done. The Electrify Africa Act, passed unanimously in both houses of Congress, codifies the principles of Power Africa. The Global Food Security Act, also overwhelmingly bipartisan, does the same for Feed the Future. The Foreign Aid Transparency and Accountability Act solidifies the gains we've made in building transparency and building and improving monitoring and evaluation. So these aren't just Obama commitments anymore. They are American commitments, and that means they have lasting power. The third driver is meaningful collaboration across the government. Now, as Scott rightly says, if you haven't been paying attention, or if you pay attention to this, when someone says interagency, your eyes roll back in your head falls off and rolls down the hallway. But it's important, and I know you all remember the chart that was done by Lael Brainerd when she was at Brookings of the big spaghetti bowl that is the interagency. Today, I think intergovernmental collaboration looks a whole lot different than it used to. With Power Africa, we've got 12 federal agencies working together. With Feed the Future, it's 11. And what we've done is to bring all the players and all the tools to the same table, and we figured out how to play to each agency's unique strengths and avoid duplication of effort. And it turns out that's when we're at our most efficient and when we can make big things happen. USAID is honored to lead both of these initiatives, but we're also proud to partner with our colleagues in a host of other areas. And with the other agencies also engaged in development work, we work together so seamlessly now that we can literally finish each other's sentences. It's a very, very different dynamic than I think it was 8 years ago. And it goes beyond that. Just last week, I was with Secretary Lew when he announced a joint fellowship program, Treasury, the State Department, and USAID, all working together to step up U.S. efforts to connect poor people in the U.S. and around the world to tools and services that help them build credit, save, and plan for a secure financial future. I even made a pitch for Treasury's budget from the stage. That did not used to happen. I made a pitch for ours too, but with Commerce, we're supporting African entrepreneurs. With the Department of Defense, we've gotten food and water to families displaced by Hurricane Matthew and constructed Ebola treatment units in West Africa. With NASA, we're arming vulnerable communities and local decision makers with the best available climate projections. The list goes on, and throughout all of this work, we've seen that when you worry more about the expertise and resources your agency brings to the table and less about who gets the credit, you can get a whole lot more done, and that's the way it should be. The fourth driver is increased commitment and engagement of developing country leaders. And I want to make a qualification here. Trust me, there's still an ample supply of leaders who are not making a sufficient commitment, but I do think we've got the emergence of a number of leaders who have made this a priority, not because we've required it or conditioned our aid on it, but because they get its importance. And you know better as well as anyone how essential this is. I think there are a growing number of leaders out there who are rising to the challenge and investing real political capital into this thing called development. Feed the Future, for example, was born in part out of African commitments before we started Feed the Future to reducing hunger and malnutrition. And today we're seeing governments dramatically up their expenditures on agriculture. We have national, local, and community leaders taking a stand against corruption, even in places where corruption is a way of life. We have governments setting ambitious goals for cutting maternal and child mortality and meeting them. We have education ministers making serious investments in girls' education and host communities opening their arms ever wider to refugees. These leaders are challenging the tired notion that development assistance necessarily breeds dependence. President Obama made it clear at the UN a few years ago how important that is when he said that no country wants to be dependent on another, and no proud leader in this room wants to ask me for aid. That's why I think our approach is working. By letting countries lead the way, we're helping them exercise the muscles of governance while making an investment in long-term transformation. Now, the fifth and final driver gets to all of you, and that is the interest and engagement of a broader and more diverse constituency than ever before. I remember when something like this would have been a smaller event. Impassioned, but smaller. Because of all the success we've achieved as the U.S. government has been as much because of the government as of our partners. The think tanks, scientists, and researchers who've helped forge a path laid by data and evidence, the big thinkers and entrepreneurs who have put their new ideas to work for others, the businesses that see opportunity where others see only risk, the NGOs, civil society, and interfaith groups that work every day to reach as many people as we can. We've taken this on seriously and revitalized relationships with great institutions of higher learning. We've strengthened our bond with communities of faith. We've connected more deeply and broadly with small and minority-owned businesses. We've launched calls for open innovation because we know that the next breakthrough solution could come from anywhere or anyone. The bottom line is this. This also isn't your grandmother's development coalition, and thankfully it's not going anywhere come January. Right? Right, okay. So apparently there's a new administration coming on board. Have you tracking that? Look, and I can't speak to what they are or not going to do. But we do know, I think, what's working, and we know that what's working is always persuasive. And we also know that our community of partners is smart, caring, and passionate, and that you know how to get things done. So if you'll indulge me for another 5, this is USAID's 55th anniversary last month, so I can have 2 lists of 5. It's kind of artful, don't you think? These are the 5 imperatives for the future. What I think are the must-dos for our community of what President Obama described at our White House Summit on Global Development, the do-gooders. 1, grow the constituency. It's there, it's active, and it's more diverse than ever, but it's still too small. Because unfortunately, there are still too many people who think foreign aid makes up 20% of the budget instead of less than 1. There are too many people who think USAID hasn't evolved or who don't think about it at all. We have to reach them and make them pay attention, and we need to communicate clearly and simply, which is code for saying don't use too much development speak, about what we're doing and why we're doing it. Growing the constituency also means nurturing the bipartisan consensus on development. It is strong, but as one of our colleagues said in a meeting the other day, it's also perishable. So we've got to grow that. And for USAID's part and for all of our partners, that means offering accountability, transparency, and efficiency. It means striving to be better and better stewards of taxpayer dollars so that we can earn the flexibility we need to do our jobs in a rapidly changing world. 2, diversify how we pay for development. I am obsessed by this one. Traditional aid by itself doesn't cut it anymore, and I think we've got ample evidence of that. And as you all know, it accounts for only about 1/10 of financial flows to the developing world. Even if it was the big game changer, I don't think we'd want to limit ourselves to aid alone. We want to build economies where private capital can flow freely and responsibly, and where governments put more skin in the game in the form of dollars invested through their own budgets. That's the only way to sustain progress, and it's the only way to answer President Obama's call to reduce dependence over time. And I would add, as a footnote of the many things I've seen as being effective with Congress, when we can say with this many dollars we've leveraged this much in private capital, that resonates and sticks. 3, we need to adapt our systems and institutions for the world we live in, one that's sharp-edged and increasingly unpredictable. And that includes USAID, which is why I'm so proud of how we've strengthened the agency and reinforced its core capabilities. Taking a page out of CGD's book, we have emphasized the discipline of development, launching an evaluation policy 5 years ago that's not static but dynamic, able to adapt and improve the more we know and the more we learn. And more impressive than the 1,400 plus evaluations we've conducted since then is the shift in culture that this new policy has fostered. We are constantly looking for ways to improve. We have the confidence to recognize when things aren't right and the know-how to fix them. This is a change that extends well beyond the project level. My predecessor and friend Raj Shah launched USAID Forward to initiate a series of reforms to make the agency more accountable, transparent, and nimble. Many of the specific reforms have been institutionalized since then, while others, like local capacity building, will and should remain a priority for years to come. So we're adding new ones because we approach reform just like we approach development. We can always learn more and can always do better. We've also embraced diversity in all of its forms, including by establishing a landmark policy that bars all recipients of USAID dollars from discriminating against beneficiaries on the basis of gender, race, sexual orientation, or any such category. And we're building a more diverse workforce because we know it makes us stronger. We've revamped our security operations and IT systems, and we've begun a long-term investment in our people through a human resource transformation effort. We want to make sure that we can retain the people we need and give our people the support they need to do their jobs well. And we do this not as a political act, but as a commitment to build our federal institutions and give back to the career men and women who serve them so well. That brings me to 4, strategic patience. In massive supply here. Look, I think we know that transformation takes time and it's worth the wait. And it's one thing to achieve impact when all the conditions are lined up and ripe for positive development outcomes. But more often they're not. USAID works in some of the toughest environments imaginable and often places in the midst of transition where the essential building blocks of progress never existed or have been eroded. We need, and Washington needs, the strategic patience it takes to support transitions for the long term and to give transformation the time it needs to bloom. And 5 is that we invest in our shared future even as we respond to the urgency of right now. There's no question that the world is a pretty scary and volatile place right now, even when set against a backdrop of global progress on development. We're living in a time where a disease can spread across an ocean in a single plane ride, and the effects of long-lasting complex crises and conflicts are spilling across borders. And when new threats and crises flare up, we have to respond as a country and as a community of partners with the same urgency and professionalism that we always do. And the demand is growing. For the last 2 years, we have often had 5 darts operating in the field at the same time. The previous average 10 or 15 years ago was 1.5. A couple of times this year, we've had 6 in the field at the same time. We can't abdicate our responsibility to meet our humanitarian obligations, but it is equally important that we keep an eye to the future. Because the only way to get ahead of many of these crises is through the long-term sustainable and inclusive development that requires that strategic patience. That's why we're prioritizing investments in resilience so vulnerable people and communities have the core capacities they need to withstand the external shocks we know are coming. This isn't going to be easy, but looking back on the last 8 years, I can proudly say that we have an agency and a government and a global coalition that is capable of tackling the hard and confident enough to pursue the bold. And I am extremely proud of what we're leaving behind and of the men and women that have made USAID what it is today. It's my sincere hope that many years from now, all that we have done will not be seen as just Barack Obama's legacy, although I think that has a very nice ring to it. My hope is that it will also be seen as the continuation of a powerful American legacy another chapter in a long-standing tradition of U.S. development leadership. A consequential chapter, to be sure, but still just one of many. Because what we're doing is so much bigger than any one person or group, and it's so much bigger than any one of us. We're working towards a world where opportunity abounds and no one is left behind, where women and girls get back all that they give, and their progress lifts up everyone around them. Where people like USAID's own Zulhaz Manan, who was killed earlier this year in Bangladesh, can live and love freely without fear of persecution or violence. A world where democratic institutions are as strong as communities are resilient, and where families have a safety net to get through the tough times. We're working toward a world where peace is possible if we just pursue it with the dogged determination of the Colombian people. A world where, with the unapologetic ambition of the people of Burma, dreams of reform can become reality. Where ordinary people, like the white helmets in Syria, digging through the rubble to find the living among the dead, don't have to become heroes. That's a world worth the work it takes to get there. And by building on what came before us and leaving something stronger and better behind, I think we're moving closer and closer to it. There are always going to be reasons to be cynical, especially when you go looking for them. But today, I'm actually more hopeful than ever. That's because of the men and women of USAID who I've been deeply honored to serve alongside, and it's because all of you and our partners across the globe who serve others with passion, respect, intelligence, and skill. It's because of the amazing things we've done together and the amazing things we still have to do. Thank you. Woo! Oh, I'm having an emotion. So Nancy, this is just like when we go out to dinner sometimes, but everybody's listening.
Well said, Gayle.
And I notice you're only serving water, but that's all right.
It kind of reminds me of when I'm at events and someone says, is Chatham House rules okay? And I say, it's okay, but actually you can quote me on anything I say. And that's the way it is with Gayle Smith. That's the beauty of your leadership.
I don't quite know how to interpret that, but I think it's probably too late for anybody to fire me, so let's go.
So, Gayle, that was really a wonderful speech. I loved the video. I think you brought a wonderful combination of substance, rigor, and emotional force to what you said about USAID and about President Obama's leadership. I have 4 questions, some prepared by my excellent colleagues. I know I won't have time to get to all of them because we also want to turn to all of you soon. But what I'll do is go one at a time, and depending on how long you take answering one, then I'll throw them all in at the end.
I can just do yes or no answers.
Right, okay. So the first one does have to do with the change in administrations that we're looking at now. Certainly the election injected a kind of new uncertainty into the future of development policy as it's seen from the U.S. So it would be very interesting to hear from you. You already intimated, what is it about the Obama and the USAID and the Gayle Smith legacy, Raj Shah, Gayle Smith, that you feel will stick in terms of, maybe you want to go back to the presidential policy directive. What is durable in a world, over time?
I'd say a few things. Look, I think a lot of the PPD is absolutely durable. It was focused on a singular goal of inclusive and sustainable economic growth, which sounds like a no-brainer, but early in the process, Scott referred to, when we asked all the agencies what are our development goals, we had 43. And so the idea is, it's that classic, we want to work ourselves out of a job. But things like evaluation, driving with data and evidence, innovation, those are things I would be surprised if those were to be abandoned. They could well be renamed.
So is that what you'll say if you
No.
have the
I have two other things, though, that
Okay,
I think are key.
But yeah, let me just add to the question, make it more interesting as you go to the other two things.
I wasn't going to be boring.
We're going, hopefully, to have a Secretary of State appointed soon. I hope that you'll have a chance to give a briefing to the next Secretary of State. First,
What
you're
would
going
I
to say data and evaluation, right? And
I'd say
What
a
are
few
you gonna
things.
say? What
I
are
would
your
say
three
all of that. I'd
things?
say a few things. I mean, I think the bipartisan support for the mission of USAID, of MCC, of all the other agencies that are out there contributing to our development goals is absolutely vital. And I say that because I have seen the ugliness of USAID and foreign assistance being Washington's political football. And it didn't serve our government well, and it certainly didn't serve the institutions well.
great point.
So that's really, I think, the first and most important point. I think driving with what works. And again, one of the things about the change in the culture, I have people walk into my office all the time and say, here's something that isn't going well. It's been revealed in an evaluation. Here's how we plan to change it. Here's our analysis of why it went wrong. So there isn't this defensive, every aid dollar works spectacularly well. It inspires confidence in the building and I think on the Hill. The other thing I hope a new administration would do, and I would recommend, is keep USAID at the policy table. And the reason I say that is that I think it serves our government extremely well in policy deliberations to have an agency at the table who fundamentally understands development and crises and how states change in a positive or negative direction and the range of tools we can bring to bear. So I'd say keep that up.
Great. Those
And
are
I'm sure
great
he or she will
messages.
say, okay.
She will say, okay.
He or she.
He or she, you'll say, okay. So actually, you've taken me to one of the other questions I had. Brian Atwood and Andrew Natsios had an article in Foreign Affairs some time ago, and they went back to this issue that you raised early in your really wonderful remarks, that it's a three-legged stool, defense, diplomacy, and development. And to the issue, actually, that I am told by colleagues President Obama mentioned at the White House Global Development Council recently, which is that someone like you should be at the table with the generals
Yeah,
when
he
there's
said that at the summit.
discussion of foreign policy. So it goes back to the larger question of USAID or some combination of development agencies being represented at the cabinet level.
You know, I think that's up to an incoming president, and there have been changes in that with things like US-UN from administration to administration.
But what would you
and-
advise, given the way the world is working right now?
I mean, I think the experience of aid during this administration has been to function essentially on par with cabinet-level agencies. We've been at the table if the deputy of USAID or I am at a policy meeting, we are there as independent deputies and principals. And I think that our colleagues would say from across the government that that has been of enormous benefit to the policymaking process, so I would continue that. Now, I've also been in government twice, and I've learned a couple things, that some of the things on the outside which seem very simple become exceedingly complex when you're on the inside. And I think there's always going to be an issue by secretaries of state who have the authority for foreign assistance about how that works. I know the case I would make. After January 20th, I will be making it. Because I think having development on par with defense and development has made a huge difference. And I think we've got the proof of concept after 8 years of essentially doing that. And I would encourage somebody to do at least that much, if not more.
Great, very
That was
good.
artful. I still have a diplomatic passport.
Yeah, I
just for
see
the
that.
record.
The one thing that you didn't refer to explicitly, I know it's on your mind, but it's very much on our minds at the center, is the role of the U.S. in taking leadership on collective action problems. And from that flows sort of the trade-off sometimes between bilateral and multilateral aid, bilateral and multilateral engagement, the approach of the U.S. on issues like climate that matter for development. Do you want to say anything about what you would also advise the next Secretary
I
of
think
State?
it's hugely important. And again, I think we've got some practice that is kind of hard to codify, but I think is important. I mean, there was a time where if the question was whether we were going to do something, say, on the foreign assistance level, bilaterally or multilaterally, people would go into their corners, she said, looking at the former Treasury official, right? That, well, if we put our bilateral dollars in a multilateral account, that will somehow diminish the role of the U.S. Again, I think we've got ample evidence that that's not the case. What that translates into is U.S. leadership on a larger multilateral platform. So I would certainly continue that. I think the U.S. has enormous influence, and the more we shape that influence, again, by evidence rather than strong opinion, the more it matters. I think the other thing we've seen a lot during this administration, which I hope we'll see a continuation of, is coalitions of the unusual suspects. So it is standard practice and has been tradition for a long time. If it's the G7, for example, you basically got the donors together. There are a number of things where, I mean, the Open Government Partnership is probably the best example. The coalition that gave birth to that, or the coalition that was behind pushing hard in Addis for the outcome we got on financing for development, was not the donors over here and the developing countries over here. It was a real mix of like-minded governments that was far more diverse than in the past. That, I think, is absolutely key, particularly if we want to avoid the kind of bifurcation that often happens if you've got donors here or rich countries here and other countries there.
Right. It's the change from MDGs to SDGs
in
a way, in a sort of grand sense.
I think that's exactly right.
Okay, last question from me, I think. I was so struck by your 60 humanitarian crises a year that USAID is engaged in. It raised for me the question, for the future, including from CGD. We've been pretty much admirers of the MCC model. That doesn't have to do with dealing with humanitarian crises. I think, is there an issue, MCC works in countries that are already performing reasonably well. USAID has a much larger mandate to deal with crises.
You get the full mix.
You get the full mix. So how would you, again, advise your successor at USAID, the Secretary of State, the White House, the people that will take up the job you took up 8 years ago, on seeing across the key agencies? MCC is less than $1 billion a year. USAID is, $26 billion a year. How should we outside think about that, and how do you think about it in a world where maybe crises and response to crises will take up more and more of development time, of development speak?
I think there are three things I'd say on that. One is we've got to build and expand the institutional capacity underneath the people who do all the crisis response, because they are responding with more dollars to more and more complex crises than ever before. And we need to invest more underneath so they have the foundation to work from. And that's kind of boring and bureaucratic, but it is absolutely key. These people are phenomenal, but we need more of them, and they need more
inside
support.
USAID.
Inside USAID. The second, I would build out the work that's been done on resilience, which has achieved phenomenal results through collaboration across the agency, but this is also something that, for example, the Treasury Department looks at from a financial perspective. What do we need to institutionalize and do as regular practice to reduce the vulnerability of the extreme poor to external shocks? We put a dart in Ethiopia before all the starving children were on television on the grounds that it was an emergency prevention dart of sorts to get ahead of.
Tell us what a DART is.
A DART is a disaster assistance response team that usually goes in when the earthquake happens. We moved earlier than we might otherwise or traditionally have done in the case of El Nino because we had these extra tools based on the work on resilience, which has to do with everything from ramping up the nutritional interventions to doing the productive safety net kinds of work that allows you to get ahead and build back a stronger base. I would build that out. I think that's something that should be a part of every intervention we've got anywhere. But the last thing, Nancy, I think is how do you develop the seamless passing of the baton and collaboration between and among agencies? And look, there was a day when I thought it'd be really nice if you had a nice white sheet of paper with nothing on it, and you redrew how all of this works. So turns out, walked into the White House, nobody could find the white sheet of paper. But you also realize that to do a massive reorg to make it all look nice on paper, you will spend 2 to 4 years of an administration getting
Working
it
it
done
out,
and working
right.
the kinks. But I think what we have done, and I think it is now practice and culture. So MCC has threshold programs. We work with them all the time on these. In a couple of cases, we are actually managing or co-managing a threshold program, passing it on to them. In other cases, we may be receding a little bit because MCC is taking on a bigger role. We do the same thing with Treasury, OPIC, TDA, a whole host of agencies now. And it's how do you incentivize that culture? How do you create the expectation of agencies that if you want to fight with each other, that's fine, but you're going to pay for it. If you want to collaborate and deliver results, then
win-win
you'll
for
get the
everybody.
rewards for it. It's hard because the natural instinct is to compete and to compete for dollars. I think what the outside community can do is help us not have the advocacy for budgets and things be competitive against one another and lump all these things together as much as you can. Because it's that universe of agencies and capabilities that makes the difference, I think.
Right, which I think helps keep the U.S. effective in development policy.
Exceedingly.
Exactly. Okay, let's turn to all of you for questions, concerns, complaints, anything you want. Where are the mics right now? Why don't
Nancy,
we
I've
start-
got only just over a month left. If you want to make complaints,
Yeah, I shouldn't.
there's a mailbox in the Ronald Reagan building.
No complaints, no complaints.
Hi, Anirban Paul.
Introduce yourself.
Anirban Paul, independent consultant. Question on capacity building. While both national and subnational capacity building is important, given the constraints on resources, on the margins, if you were to reallocate resources away from national to subnational, what would be your take or impression on outcomes? Worsen, flat, or decline? And I know it's a vague question because it's lumping in a lot of categories and countries.
I'm not sure I completely follow the question whether you're saying would subnational be better than national?
Yes.
Look, we're tracking all of that. And the fact of the matter is, as in any country, you need both. You've got to have the subnational capacity, but if you don't have the national capacity, you look at something like Power Africa, if you don't have the capacity to develop and sustain a regulatory environment that's going to enable the kind of investment that's going to be the game changer, it's not going to work. So I think you have to have both. What the agency has done, and I think will keep doing, is tracking and monitoring the work on local ownership so that we know what some of those answers are. But I don't think we've set it up as a choice between either national or subnational, because I think depending on what our aims are and what our partners are, and from a development perspective, I think we've really got to have both.
Okay, I saw some hands over here. Yeah, please. No, you're third. He's second. Sorry.
Good morning. My name is Femi Akibi. I'm with African Trade and Development Council, and I'm a Nigerian. My question is China-U.S. relationship with Africa. What is the difference between the U.S. model and the Chinese model?
In a way.
The Chinese seems to put pressure on area of hard infrastructure, while the U.S. seems to deal with soft infrastructure. The Chinese is able to attach their involvement in this development to some level of infrastructural and mineral attachment to it. The U.S. seems to do the soft infrastructure and leave the scene for other people to eat our lunch. I like your take on it.
Look, I think the models are vastly different but ever evolving, and I think the U.S. also has a bit of a history in investing in the mineral part of infrastructure around the world. So, but I think, look, President Obama's direction has been very clear on this. We have a deep and complex relationship with China, and it's one where he has sought to maximize those areas where we can try to seek some agreement. And interestingly, development has been one of them. I have led for the interagency U.S.-China development partnership, which has been often challenging but always interesting. And where I think we have found on things like cooperation on the Ebola response, we just signed an MOU to work together on the establishment with the AU of an African Centers for Disease Control. There's some other areas of cooperation on humanitarian response. We're doing some training for them. I think what we're trying to do is identify some areas where we agree, but I think we've also struck an agreement to have more dialogue before we go into multilateral fora, which I think is enormously helpful. On infrastructure, our models are very different. Now, aid doesn't have the budget, and there was, which decade was it that infrastructure was the flavor of, there's always new flavor of the month. I would say that I think with Power Africa, we have come on to something that could prove very, very significant in terms of infrastructure. I think the search has been for what the silver bullet is. This has been a debate in the G20 and elsewhere. The assumption has been it's massive amounts of capital. China can do that and does that on terms that I think we would have some disagreements with. But if you need a road built and they're willing and able to do it, fine, go ahead and do it. I think what we've discovered with Power Africa, there are good projects, there's willing capital. It's not happening. There are multiple barriers. They're not any one single barrier. We've put all the tools in the federal government together so that we can break down those barriers project by project, demonstrate success so that it's replicated, and I think facilitate the flow of private capital to infrastructure. I think that's probably a more lasting solution than an assumption that the foreign aid budget is going to continue to double every year such that we can do U.S. government hugely capital-intensive investments in infrastructure. So I think we have found a way to do infrastructure in a different way as well.
Yeah, I think that's really an important point, that it's not so much infrastructure-based versus social, as nowadays the approach to doing things like investing in public infrastructure. And the U.S. model is very much about bringing private capital, matching it with reforms, discussion and dialogue about the necessary reforms. I think the Chinese will move in that direction at some point. And they do, in a way, indirectly through the multilateral banks that they support.
Yeah, that's right.
There was, yes.
Rumu Sarkar, Millennium Partners, and in the interest of full disclosure, I was an attorney with the Office of the General Counsel at USAID for 11 years.
Well,
Nancy,
thank you for that. I love those GC people.
Nancy, you mentioned a three-legged stool consisting of defense, diplomacy, and development. So, Gayle, in your view, is there a missing dimension, a fourth leg? If so, what would that be, and how would you advise the new incoming administration on that?
A four-legged stool is a chair.
Right.
I don't know. I mean, I haven't really
It's
thought of that.
steadier if we could find a fourth leg, but
Yeah, but I think you get too many legs, and I don't know what happens to the piece of furniture. I would have to think about that, but I actually think, I mean, when I think of it, like, what is, it sounds nice, the 3Ds. In practical terms, what it actually means, I think is something that we have begun to translate into practice. I think it is more and more common practice within the federal government. And again, like I said, I think we've got proof of concept. I'm not sure I would add a fourth. I think there is, if there's a fourth, it's the constituencies and the partners outside the executive branch. It's the bipartisan support for the Congress and a diverse constituency.
oh, there you
I
go.
think
Brilliant.
that is a five-legged pentachair.
I think your most the point you made about patience
That's the single
important
hardest
because development is this long-term horizon
Yeah.
thing. Security or defense and diplomacy tend to be more short-term imperatives.
Yeah.
And so you need the development person there with patience to see beyond the short-term worries, crises, and so on.
Yeah,
So
and it's
that's
no
why 3
coincidence.
legs. But
I mean, from the time I served on, there was a congressional commission, I don't know, 100 years ago, looking at foreign aid, and from the time when we launched the PPD and then Secretary of Defense Gates was on the stage, that our military, both the uniform and civilian side of the house, is one of the biggest supporters of the development mission of the government for that reason.
They need that input. Okay, we had Let's go back there. Yeah, let's hear about evaluation.
I think the fourth D
Introduce
should be
yourself.
dames. We need more women in development, defense, and diplomacy.
I'm for that. We have a lot of them right now.
That's true.
Don't forget to introduce yourself.
I'm going to. My name is Annette Brown, and I'm with FHI 360, but until recently was with the International Initiative for Impact Evaluation. And Nancy has correctly intuited that I'm going to ask a question about evaluation. I was very encouraged to hear your emphasis on evidence and evaluation, and to correctly highlight that there's been a lot more evaluation at USAID in the last 8 years. Just yesterday, there was an event right here in this room where several speakers, I won't name any names, were actually critical of USAID, arguing that although there's been a lot of evaluation, that's been focused on performance evaluation, or shorter evaluations that may be more about accountability than impact evaluations that are more for a learning purpose. And so I'm curious to get your views on what you see as the role of USAID and USAID development work in terms of producing the public good, a global public good around evidence that could be done through evaluation, as opposed to just conducting evaluations for the purpose of our own learning and accountability for our own programming.
Well, I think we've got to do both, and it's okay if you publish the names of whoever said it, because I will tell you, when we have meetings of senior leadership in the agency, or meeting with the team that does evaluation, Wade Warren is here, who leads the bureau that handles this, there is plenty of criticism and articulation of additional new and more aspirations within the agency as well. And the other thing I think is really important is that this isn't like static. It's not like there's a new evaluation policy, here's how we're going to do it, check that box, done. I think the thing that is exciting is that it's seen as a living, breathing phenomenon, so that whether it is collaboration with your previous organization or others, what are we learning about the state of the art on evaluation? How can we expand it and improve? How do we build the feedback loop, which in my personal view, in my personal or professional view, will be immaterial to the people running AID in a short time, is that the first stage, I think, necessarily has to be accountability and management of US taxpayer resources. Because that's our job, that's our responsibility. And I think in the eyes of our Congress, which does have oversight, it may be the single most meaningful element of what is a really changed relationship. I saw somebody I had known on the Hill who was from the other party and highly critical of aid back in the 1990s, and his criticism then was, well, you always say every project is a success. Now, I think that's a bit of an overstatement. But what he observed is that people have much more confidence if an aid team comes up to brief, this worked, this didn't, we changed it this way and that way. But it takes the confidence that nobody's going to cut your head off if you do that. And I think we're getting, because it used to be in the old days, if you said that, your head was on the floor. So I think we're getting to that point. I think the second most important stage, in my view, is the feedback loop within the agency, so that you may do an evaluation of a particular program in a particular country or region. That's useful for that program, and you got to do that, but that is going to have invaluable insights that can translate across the agency. How do we aggregate what we learn and apply it more broadly on the front end of program design? That we can and should contribute to a global public good, I think everybody would agree with. And I think is certainly an absolutely legitimate aspiration, but I think we have a strong foundation. I think there's still some internal work to do in terms of what the priorities are before that would be kind of number one on the list. But I wouldn't exclude it at all. I think it's a really good area for the agency to expand its work.
Yeah, that's certainly one of the things, the emphasis on evaluation that one hopes is durable from one administration to the next. But the question, the question, I can't restrain myself from asking about outcomes. I mean, I think Annette is referring not to, she's saying how to make the distinction between the importance you put legitimately on evaluating the USAID program as a kind of accountability to US taxpayers, and the role of outside donors in not getting in the way between a government that's being supported directly or indirectly, and its own citizens, so that those citizens can evaluate, in effect, or make accountable their own government. And that's one of the, that has to do with ultimately the impact on citizens of. So, that's a tough one.
But I think that's a fair one. I think, again, OGP is a good model because I think there's been some really important learning in that, the Open Government Partnership.
Oh, yeah.
Of how you actually
Fantastic model.
do those two things at the same time. I'm not sure that, look, when you're running a federal government agency and you go through a confirmation hearing and budget hearings and stuff, you do realize to whom you're accountable. And so I think that while it is absolutely important, I don't think there's any intention to get in between citizens and their government in terms of an evaluation. I think aid has an obligation, as does MCC and every other agency, to be able to account for resources. So I don't see one at the expense of the other. I do want to piggyback on one thing you said, though, Nancy, and I think it's one of the really important pieces of what lies ahead, which is that we have a strong foundation on, it started, I think, on global health with the support of Senators Kerry and Frist, and then President Bush's big move on PEPFAR, President Obama's decision from the get-go to expand it dramatically, but give President Bush credit at every opportunity, which is what he told us to do. We've now got that on Power Africa, on Electrify, on a number of things.
Feed the Future.
Where we've got to have, yes, Feed the Future. Where we've got to have, I think, bipartisan agreement is that we will take it as a nonpartisan obligation to pass from one administration to another those things which are not political but which have to do with the effectiveness and strength of the institution. So on something like evaluation, it is my sincere hope that the next team and the next team and the next team will do 2.0 and 3.0 and 4.0, that they will listen carefully to the career men and women who run the agency through the impact and great joy of all of us, right? And that things like the human resource transformation that we're doing, the single biggest complaint I get from everybody, the personnel system in USAID was not built for the USAID we need. We've started a process. It can't be concluded in 4 years or 2 years. We've got to pass that to the next team, and we have to have the same bipartisan commitment to making this agency strong and effective. Because if we flip-flop back and forth on these reforms from administration to administration,
right.
Well, what I walked into was an agency that was covered with Scotch tape and chewing gum, and 27 layers of well-intentioned reform efforts by different administrations, very few of which had looked at what was being passed on. So that's the other thing I really hope we can pass on. It's not political, it's not partisan.
I did want to, DIV, your innovation group.
Development of it, yep.
That's like evaluate, that is in my category, this focus on innovation and evaluation and scaling up. I hope you'll pass that on too.
Well, one of the things we have, and I give Raj and a large team of people a lot of credit for this, of creating the Global Development Lab, which I think serves a couple of functions. And what we've been trying to do over the past year is make sure the lab has the sort of autonomy it needs to be wildly creative, but is also sufficiently institutionalized and part of the agency that it isn't just seen as some extension that can be lopped off. And I think it provides two valuable functions. One is the innovation itself in terms of our development interventions, but also the innovation in how we do business, whether it is evaluations or anything else. Now, the other place where I have drawn a lot of, I think, strength and been educated on this is also from, as I say, the career men and women who are the backbone of the agency. Because it's those people who have been doing this for 55 years. And political appointees come along, and we are all utterly brilliant, and they are all exceedingly grateful that we've arrived to shine a light and show them the path forward. And I think you make a mistake if you assume that the outside new team has all the ideas. I think you can really succeed if you take the new ideas and creativity that can come out of a lab, which is a new and I think extremely valuable addition to USAID, But you put that on top of people who may have tried 6 times the things I come in with and say, you know what would be really cool to do? And somebody says, yes, we did that in 1971, 1978, 1987. So I think you got to blend the two. But it's important to keep an eye on the lab, because I think that will remain part of the agency. I think we've gotten it in a good place, and it's strong and delivering. So
it has some roots, institutional.
I think it's got roots, and I think it's got the autonomy it needs, but I think it's rooted in the agency.
Okay, a couple more questions. Yes, you had your hand up before, I think.
Thanks very much. It's Isabella Bunn. I'm based at Oxford, and I appreciate Gayle and of course, the center, everything you do. The changing political landscape extends far beyond the Beltway. We've just witnessed Brexit. There is a strong anti-global sentiment in general, and specifically a feeling of we need to take care of our own, and pressure on foreign assistance budgets seen as something that is not necessary and even dangerous to taking care of our own. So I was wondering if you could comment on the imperatives moving forward, both in terms of more broadly what this changing political landscape means for AID and other development efforts and the collaboration, and more specifically on the foreign aid question and how are you going to meet those challenges? Thanks.
Look, it's going to be very interesting. While I'm on the beach, look, a new administration, this happened to us when we came in 2009. You've got a pretty tight deadline as soon as you come in to deliver a budget. And there will be considerable debate on that budget. And I think that's an important space to watch. And I think there could well be pressure on the foreign aid budget. I don't know. I have no way of knowing what the case will be. I think it's actually fared pretty well during the last 8 years, given the moment we started that Scott described and the extremely healthy, mature, and entirely rational debates about the budget over the last 8 years. So I think it's done pretty well. I think what we've got to do, and what I hope AID will do, but also its friends and the other agencies in government, is, again, the more we can translate the importance of these investments into practical things that people can touch, feel, and see, and understand that people come from different perspectives. Some are going to be driven by the national security imperative. Some, and this came up a lot as people suddenly woke up to realize that there were 60 million refugees or 65 million refugees, and there was a crisis, that maybe there is a connection between development and stability in the places they are fleeing and the number of refugees who go to Europe. Maybe a national security, maybe an economic imperative. There is a constituency of support for this work in the private sector that was not as diverse or prominent as it is now, and I think that's because they're looking for new markets in which to invest, and new consumers, and development is one of the things that affords that. There was always, I think, an enduring values-based interest in this, and I think the faith community has played an extremely important role at the forefront of that, as have students and young people, and obviously a rich array of NGOs and civil society organizations. That tends to cross party lines. And so I think we've got to push on all three of these and show the return. I think what we've also got to do, though, is be prepared to show that we can leverage, that we can stop programs that don't work, expand programs that do work. It's why a lot of the work on evaluation and transparency is geared very much to buying that confidence that is needed so that a member of Congress can persuade his or her constituency that this dollar is worth spending overseas rather than here. It's hard. It's always hard. The one thing I would ask of the broad community, I think the times that it gets the most challenging is when you have 22 groups advocating for a budget and particular earmarks in that budget. Because the danger there is that, okay, so spending in this sector will go up, but spending in this sector will go down. So it's my hope that the community will be advocating for a robust development account more broadly rather than each individual piece. So I think a really broad coalition that does that, I think it's good practice anyway, but I think it'll make a big difference.
That's a great way. I know there, well, let me give Alex a question. That's only fair. But I'm sorry, apologize. I know Gayle needs to leave in about a minute. So let's give Alex the last question. And I apologize to those of you who, in my random
Hello, Alex.
pointing.
Hi, Gayle. Gayle, thank you for
Introduce
what has really
yourself,
been.
Alex. Introduce yourself.
Yeah, my name is Alex Thier, formerly with USAID and the incoming executive director at the Overseas Development Institute in London. And thank
CGD
you.
partner.
Yes. And thank you for what has really been a relentless 8 years of elevating development for all of us. I think the community really thanks you. I was hoping maybe you would reflect a little bit on South Sudan. And
You want to end this on an up note?
yeah, and an up note. And maybe use that to reflect a little bit more broadly on what you think of as the shortcomings, not only of the US government approach, but international community ability to deal with fragile states.
Well, I think I think there are a few things that come to mind on South Sudan other than rage. One, it comes back to this strategic patience notion that there are a lot of countries where the rebuild post-crisis, post-war, post-peace agreement is much more fundamental across the board than is often realized. And therefore, the expectations that are set up are too vast. And so I think that's a case where I think the expectation of South Sudan by donors, by the South Sudanese, by the region, were that it could go from where it was to something more functional in terms of a government and a state, were far greater than they perhaps should have been. I think the key thing on fragile states, and this is something where aid does tremendous work, there's been a lot of focus on this internal across the federal government, is the place where we need more investment. And again, it's the hardest place to make the case for investment because it takes a long time to show outcomes. These are countries that often do not meet a sort of MCC standard,
As
even
you
for
said,
a threshold program.
High risk, high return.
They're high
places.
risk, they're high return, but it's a return that may be 10, 15, 20 years down the road. And I think we've got to be able to make a better case for why it's important and use examples more effectively. I mean, the Ebola epidemic may not have been an epidemic, it may have been an outbreak if it had not happened in fragile states. But that's where the next one's likely going to happen as well. So I think, we all talk about fragile states and we all know what we're talking about. This is when I say we got to make the constituency bigger. I think there's a whole lot of people that have no idea what we're talking about when we talk about fragile states. So I think the more we can use evidence and analysis to explain that, there's a great study, and you may know who actually did it, of transitions over the last 50 years.
In countries.
Yeah, across the world. It was a transition since like 1945 or something. But it looked at the number that succeeded, which was about a third. It looked at the number that failed, which was about a third. But those in the middle took, on average, and I'm making this up, which is a wise thing to do when you make the case for evidence and analysis and you're sitting at CGD. But the main takeaway, though, was that those that succeeded took 10 to 15 years to even get to the point that you could say there's some success. Somalia came off the list. That was not a 4-year or 8-year proposition, and it is nowhere off the list of things that could still go south.
I think it's a CGD paper, Pritchett, Houseman.
I think it probably is, but I think that's the kind of thing that's got to be put out there, and we got to be very careful of the jargon because I think you can make the case to do the investments, but I don't think we're necessarily going to break through if our line is just we need to do more in fragile states or you get South Sudan. So I think we got to deepen it. So if you're going to go run ODI, Alex, you're here at CGD. Like people got to take this on and use the new fragile states assessment that is coming out in January from the team at USAID.
Gayle, let's all give Gayle a hand. It's magnificent.
Thanks.